Welcome to the Re-Review Podcast, where we watch movies from our past with a perspective from today. Your hosts are Matt, Bobby, and Austin, and we have an immense love for the films of our youth, so we're taking a look back to see if they still hold up. On this episode, we're discussing Rounders. Released in 1998, it was directed by John Hall and stars Matt Damon, Edward Norton, Gretchen Mol, John Malkovich, John Turturro, Martin Landau, and Famke Janssen. This movie tells the story of a high-stakes poker player not being able to escape his past and present. Now, this is a fair warning. We're spoiling a 23-year-old movie, so if you haven't seen it, we'll be revealing key plot points. This was Austin's choice this week, so I'll open up the discussion. You know, I have to say, I have a fondness for a movie that is made for very specific niche audiences. Because I'll tell you right now, if you don't know anything about poker, I have no idea how you could necessarily enjoy this film. I say this specifically because I don't think they give you the necessary information to know what's happening. They make call outs to people who are big in the poker scene, and for 1998, understandably big in the poker scene, but this is before the early 2000s big Chris Moneymaker World Series of Poker ESPN thing that went, brought it into the limelight where everyone started playing poker. In fact, I'm pretty confident I may not have seen this movie until after that time when I started playing poker like everyone else. I just don't know how if you don't necessarily have the knowledge about this game that it can really relate to you. And that's my way of saying that, looking at these characters and what they do, I don't know how to be tied to them without the game of poker being involved. So my understanding of poker, my interest in poker meant that I was kind of tied in and did enjoy it. It reminded me a bit like a heist movie at times, especially with the way the music worked. I also think it could have been a TV show. It felt at moments because I was expecting the Law and Order music to come in at any moment, even though it maybe, didn't need to. But there's just these elements of, could you imagine having a friend as bad as Worm in your life? And would you still have that friend in your life? And what would you do with someone like that in your life? How quickly would you disown him? Because Matt Damon's character sure gives him a long leash, let's say. And we won't even get into the fact that there was some animal harm. Okay, Matt, how do you feel about this film?
I definitely agree that it's. I think one of my notes I took down was it was very lingo intensive. I'm not even going to pretend like I understood half of the stuff they were talking about. I'm not a poker player. I'm one of those guys that showed up at the table when they're in Atlantic City that they were totally just conning out of money. That would have been me, except for I would have lost one hand and be like, I'm out. I'm just going to go drink, So there's a lot of stuff that I was not necessarily lost. I understood the context of a lot of the stuff they're talking about, but when they're dropping lingo after lingo after lingo, especially towards the end, I was just like, I guess that's a good thing. I suppose it's a good thing, but I just kind of had to roll with it. So, to me, that's one of the things that I guess was a detriment. Just watching the movie from my perspective is the fact that I'm not a poker player. I can appreciate the gunslinger nature of how a lot of it's played. And I guess that was kind of the thing that I guess threw me off about this movie is the parts that I found myself enjoying were very much the moments when it was, player versus player, very much like a spaghetti Western, where you had that tension that was occurring. Whereas like the middle parts involving Worm and a bunch of the, lackluster decisions that were being made wasn't really interesting to me. It was more like I was watching like a Scorsese movie about like gangsters just going through a bunch of bad shit, right? Yeah. And so I think that's where I kind of got lost. But the last game at the end, it was hooking me because, one, John Malkovich just has that look, right? I'll never believe he was a Russian, but he still scared the shit out of me with that stare, Yeah, I think one of my other notes I wrote down is this is such a 90s movie. You could have made this movie at any other era and it would
Is
have
that like
worked.
when you say that such a 90s film, are you talking about, I didn't really mention it, but in terms of the pacing and the way everything was laid out about the film?
I think the pacing, the character types, the I mean, even down to the cinematography and the music, it's very much in line with 90s, specifically around the mid to late 90s is the kind of movie you'd really expect. You could very easily, watch a movie like this and watch I'm not going to say it's on the same level of quality, but something like Usual Suspects and be like I get that these things take place in the same era, even ignoring things like cars and clothes and technology. It just feels like a 90s era movie.
Yeah, I think that was kind of my idea of it feeling like a very specific niche, type of film for an audience that is knowledgeable of poker. What I was going to ask you both for help with is, can we think of other films that are like that? Because I was trying to look for something that also falls into this realm. Like this is really made for only this group of people. Bobby.
One of the things that I'll have to think about those kinds of films, but I mean, one thing that really stands out to me in this film, which is obvious, and you guys mentioned it, is the cast. I mean, I think this film really benefits from an amazing cast. I mean, like, there's even like side characters like Famke Janssen, who was hardly in it, but she was really likable and memorable, and her character, and a number of other like really good character actors who played really well parts. And I mean, I think that I was able to believe what was happening. I've played poker in people's houses before, and I've actually never played poker in a casino. I've played blackjack, but not poker. But I believed what I was seeing from the poker games to some of the other seedier kind of places. And I believed that this world existed, like, even though, like, this is kind of like a in the shadows kind of world. Like, I believe that this is happening when I'm asleep or when I'm at home watching TV. Like, I kind of got that feeling from this movie that it made sense to me. And like, yeah, some of the language, like, I didn't really understand, but I thought it likened to the authenticity of the world for me. And I mean, I thought it was a engaging story that, that held my interest. And I mean, I want to talk about Worm for a little bit because, he is like at the same time both intriguing to watch and very difficult to watch. Like, to me, almost watching this movie again makes me think that probably Worm is the villain of this film.
This is me not disagreeing. Wait, agreeing. Sorry, two negatives. It was one of those things where I guess he did a great job, Ed Norton as Worm, because I hated him the whole time, especially as things went on and he just kept doing more despicable things as a character and really betraying a friendship. And when you have someone who's willing to go to bat for you like that and you still F it up that hard, that's tough.
Well, and at the end of the day, for me, Worm's character was, I don't know if I would say he was necessarily the villain of the movie because it definitely didn't try to steer in that direction. I feel because to me, I don't think necessarily any of the characters were necessarily redeeming. Even Matt Damon's character, um, maybe Martin Landau's character is probably the closest because he seemed like the only one who actually had any decent intentions throughout the movie. I think to me, Worm is kind of the other side of the coin of Matt Damon's character, whereas Matt Damon's character was very much into the game for the game. Um, and yeah, there was money involved, but to him, it was more about the sport of it, more about the win, more about the victory. Whereas Worm, to him, it was just a means to an end, and he didn't care how he got there. It was just another con to him. It literally could have been anything. It was just to him, it's one of the few cons that he can get the most amount of money out of.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because it's almost like you say that Worm is the other coin. Well, it's almost like John Turturro's character was another side of that because he's the guy who says, "Hey, look, here's what you become when you just play the game just to have it be your life and pay his bills."
Yeah, I mean, this was a good angel on one shoulder, bad angel on the other, right?
Totally.
But at the same time,
Um,
I would actually say neither one of them actually understood Matt Damon's character. which I should probably look up. What Mike McDermott.
Mike.
It starts with M. It's Matt. It's Matt. He might as well just pull a Jack Nicholson. He's Matt.
There should be a rule that you can't name the actor and the character. So close.
So I mean, to me, I don't think like either one of them necessarily understood what his intentions necessarily were, because again, they were both using the game for completely different reasons. At the end of the day, it still was about money for the two of them. And to be honest, I don't think that if Mike was one of those people who was funded, right? So somebody was funding his card playing, he'd be fine, because technically at the end of the day, like, he doesn't really care about the money.
He wanted the glory.
Yeah, it's just, he kept rewatching that one clip, right? He just wants that moment in his life where he can pull that, that out from nowhere win that just shows the skill and, allows him to, just be in the game, right? The money's just there. It's just what he gets as a result of it.
What is his end game, right? Like, he fights for the World Series of Poker. If he wins it, like, that's not just one thing you win once and then say, okay, I'm done, I'm out. Like, it's kind of like, to your point, a path that doesn't end.
And to be fair, this is where I guess this movie didn't work nearly as much for me, just in the sense of the kind of movies that I enjoy, because in Matt's version of Rounders, that really was what he would have been aiming for, right? Playing the game, trying to play different kinds of opponents and stuff like that, even if it ended the same way, versus, the playing against the guy that you lose against, because that's very much a 90s trope, right? The people that you lose against at the beginning of the movie is the one that you end up, going against at the end. I mean, it's probably like Mighty Ducks, just with more gambling, cussing, and, strip clubs. But, it's very much that 90s kind of sports movie, really.
Can we combine these films? I want a hockey film with all the things you just described.
No, I love how you mentioned sports, because I think, Austin, when you were mentioning, what other films is this kind of like, it's definitely a sports movie, like Hoosiers or Rudy or various movies where, like, okay, people don't really like the sport, but maybe they could still watch and be entertained by the movie. And it is interesting to kind of like put this movie in the same category as various other sports movies.
I guess the difference for me there, though, is I'm thinking of that, 1998, what football is, what baseball. I feel like the overall understanding of a sport, it has a greater relevance. And I'm not saying there weren't people who played poker. Obviously they were, but man, I felt like this movie was made for people who really play poker. Like, clearly they had poker experts and, did their research to have this dialed in. But if you showed me this in 1990, I'd be like, what am I watching? Like, why? It's not the same level as a football or a baseball, especially at that time.
I still want to know how we have a Matt Damon movie about poker and Ben Affleck isn't in this movie. How the hell did that happen? Seriously. Even a cameo of Ben Affleck in Atlantic City would have been amazing. Yet here we are. What the heck?
1998 failed us immensely.
Ben Affleck was too busy making rom-coms.
Was it that early? No. Yeah, I guess that's why it just feels really separate to me. And while I was trying to figure out something else that is like it, but I couldn't nail it with that specificity. Again, with the language that Matt referenced, it just doesn't seem right. And I'm telling you right now, the thing for me is, if you wanted to show this to someone, let's say show it to someone that, is in their early 20s today, poker doesn't have the same weight that it did through that big rush in the 2000s. So we could be back in that exact same space where someone watching this film thinks, what in the world? Again, it's really specific.
And see, here's my thing too, right? This is where like the movie did lose me as I was watching it, was as a non-poker player, as somebody who's not really interested in even watching poker or anything like that. I feel like they did a disservice to it. And again, maybe that's because poker and the sport of poker wasn't really the point. Again, it was just a vehicle for this, Scorsese mafia-esque movie, right? It's more about, this friendship that, is being dragged through the mud and trying to avoid payout, and, that ticking time bomb of you have 3 days to pay us 25K or else, very casino-esque or whatever. I think had it taken a different approach where poker was more of, and I'm sure there's probably movies about poker specifically, but to me, like, if you really wanted to draw people into the game of poker to kind of understand the passion that Mike had, it would have been at least started off and kind of had like the first act along the lines of, like, have you guys watched Up in the Air with George Clooney?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're going around, basically a movie about a dude going around firing people. But the way that the first act is set up with how he gets into travel, how he goes about it, very much explained. Not that I expected to sit here and explain every bit of terminology, but there's a lot of movies where I feel like they successfully bring you into a niche sport or activity in the narration. If you're going to do narration, I feel like that's where you're supposed to be using narration, where, you do inform the audience, not necessarily about your character and their intent, but about, just think about, like, The Big Short. The movie's about, the financial system, the most boring thing ever, but because it's presented in a manner that informs the viewer, they're allowed to actually go along with it, even if they don't understand financial terminology and how the system works, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could definitely say I would have liked everything you just described to be applied to this film. I'll pivot. What about his relationship?
This feels like a trap. Relationship with Worm or relationship with Joe? Because otherwise I feel like this is a trap against me.
You're killing me.
I think it's clear that
relationship with everyone. How's that? Let me give you an out so you can pick the one you want to talk about.
It's clear that a lot of the characters, like, that they served a purpose, right? And, we talked about some characters being a moral compass, and in the case of
what was Joe? Joe? I'm asking about Joe.
She was the catalyst for him to, and Worm played a part in this too, but she was the catalyst for him to pick his calling.
But that's the frustration, right, Matt?
You bastard. I shouldn't have said anything while we watched this movie. You knew what my weakness was. All right. I will. Okay. All right. Joe infuriates me because she is the nagging girlfriend wife trope, right? She is the one who's supposed to sit there, tell the main character he's wrong, saying that he's supposed to choose his boring life or whatever the hell, they represent. And it's always such a drag on the character. Like, I'm glad Famke was in this, because I would have been like, there would have been no interesting female characters in this entire movie, because Joe is just a waste of space.
It's a bit frustrating because it's basically the setup of, oh, here's supposed to be your white picket fence dream partner, and you've got her. And oh no, don't go do the bad thing that she doesn't want you to do, because even though that's the pursuit of your life, as you're told by your mentor, don't go do it. I think it's really, really hard when, as usual, they don't develop that character to be anything other than what Bobby described, just to be there to.
And so here's my thing, right? Like, I don't mind whenever they have those kind of characters, but you have to establish in the first act that his gambling destroyed his life, right? That she's not trying to do it just to be the nitpicker, the nagger, or whatever. It's because she saw that it would have just, like, it was destroying his life. It put him into poverty. It caused him to start drinking. Some reason why she had to be there to be it. It's never really explained. And to be honest,
had to drive trucks overnight.
Oh, yeah, that's such a terrible life that lots of people have to do. He was studying to become a lawyer, right? Like, and again, they just didn't spend enough time establishing it. And, I'm going to move on past Joe, because, to be honest, there's nothing built there. They didn't earn any of it. So Joe doesn't exist. Worm's relationship with him is probably the more thought out and on-screen developed relationship that's there or whatever. And it is kind of a trope too, where you would see the what was it, Going Straight character getting dragged down by their old friend from the old neighborhood, right? Like, you see that sometimes in movies and TV shows. I do feel like, and I think it's even like the same set, but I might have even seen this a few other times in movies similar to this, where the friend took the bullet And so like they felt like they owe them. And so that's kind of the reasoning why Matt Damon's character is, allowing Worm to do his worm stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
That's true.
Right.
He didn't rat anyone else out.
But and see, this is where I guess, the relationship, it's a very abusive relationship, right? It's almost, domestic abuse that we're seeing between these two, where uh, that thankfully they never really Worm's character never really held that over his head, right? It might have been something that we as the audience saw over their head, but it was never really brought up. But it is very much, this just, constantly barraging Matt Damon's character with the worst decisions and Matt Damon's character. And I don't know if Worm was necessarily designed in a way that he took advantage of it. I mean, he definitely did, but it never really came off that way. Like it seemed like he was intentionally trying to sabotage Matt Damon's life. He might have belittled him for making those choices, but again, that was the difference between their end games, right? Matt Damon wanted to become a professional poker player, and Worm just wanted to make a quick buck, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How much does the show not tell come into play here? I guess I'm thinking of the scene where he goes and finds him in the church basketball court / theater room. Maybe it was a church room. I'm not sure, but it felt so odd for him to go on this tale. This is where you always come when you get into trouble. Ha ha ha. We're back here again. I knew where you were. And I was just like, really?
It probably wasn't the most egregious amount of exposition I've seen, but it definitely, it's what happens when you don't spend much time prior kind of establishing the character types, or at least going into their backstory nearly as much. Because like literally their backstory kind of started with that one event, right? That, landed him in prison. I can't remember how long he was in prison for, but they didn't really, like, I don't know how long they knew each other. I mean, I guess they kind of established, since they were much younger, but you didn't really get too deep into it until they got to the church, which I guess was abandoned because he said he lived there for like half a year, right, but it didn't look abandoned because it looked pretty clean. So I guess he just had like a little spot in the auditorium he could hide, I guess.
I thought it was weird that he had the basketball. He still missed his little layup that he did. That was the only thing that he did with it. Just completely
his only failure as a character. He missed it.
He totally missed that layup.
He missed his shot.
Bobby, I'll go to you for any cinematography items. What did you like about the way the film was actually shot?
There was a definite look to it. I'll use some like abstract terms like grittiness, and I noticed a lot of, like amber lighting, which was probably pretty popular in the 90s. And
I did make the comment that I wanted to go to a speakeasy after watching this.
Yes.
I kind of miss being in like a dark hole with a fancy cocktail. Again, not anything related to the cars, but I was like, oh, you know what? Speakeasy sounds nice. So you're right.
I thought it was overall very well done. I mean, nothing very flashy. Like it was all pretty grounded story, which, is probably what made you think that it could have been a TV episode. But from a storytelling point of view, that gets me is the voiceover. And I did think that the voiceover was interesting, but I think that leads to your show, don't tell. And a lot of times student films have voiceovers, right? And sometimes when a film has a voiceover, it's a very tricky thing because sometimes a voiceover is very like well thought out and well done, and it really adds a lot to the movie. And I certainly think that this voiceover added some things to a movie. But what I always think about when there's a voiceover is I think about something that I read with the Blade Runner movie, which is there are times in film making when voiceovers are added afterwards to kind of fill in story holes and gaps, and they're basically placed there by focus groups and by producers saying, I don't understand the story, we need somebody to explain it to us. What do you guys think of the successfulness or not of the voiceover?
I mean, me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of it just because, again, I feel like it wasn't, if anything, it wasn't poignant enough. It wasn't, informative enough. As far as the what they were doing, the in and outs of underground poker playing, right? Any exposure I have is either in Vegas or on TV. So just the whole concept of the underground poker world wasn't really explained nearly as well as it probably could have been. I said it when we started watching, as soon as it was like, oh, narration. I mean, I guess I'll still take narration over text on screen, right? I don't, outside of Star Wars, I do not want to see text at the beginning of the movie.
I was like, scrolling text. I'm sure there's a fond place in your heart for some good scrolling text.
There are exactly 3 good ones, 3 okay ones, and 3 bad ones that get away with that. Everything else, no text on screen, please.
Yeah, I mean, the narration's interesting just because, again, they were, like you mentioned, if they were filling in the gaps after the fact, they still failed, unfortunately. I mean, it was fine, but it's just one of those where, he was talking over kind of generic scenes. I feel like I can't even like really recall anything poignant other than, like you said, filling in some information that wasn't really there. Let's switch it to, it's 2021. You remake this movie today. What are you doing differently?
It sounds weird. And I don't know if necessarily I still would have made this movie the way that it's currently made, but I say the movie's from Worm's perspective and he's narrating it. I think that it would have been a much more interesting movie to start off in him in jail, like that opening scene with him in jail and him actually narrating the process. I don't know if you'd still be able to pull off his arc and be an interesting character, but I think that's
Does he get a redemption story, or you want to see him just drive into the ground to where he's getting taken out by Teddy KGB?
TBD.
What did he do? He was because he was gone they basically said, "Okay, go away. I will fix this. You go away."
It really was a vanishing character act after that point. He did disappear when Matt says, I'm gonna go talk to him and take care of this, and I need you out of my life. And he just said, all right, then take the car and go.
So I'm assuming he calls him at some point and says, yeah, I figured everything out.
Probably not, to be honest. And see, that's I guess the most frustrating thing, because such a good chunk of this movie was focused on the relationship, and for it to have just dropped off like that makes it so unfulfilling. And yeah, he started the whole chain of events that kind of led to the ending scene. And don't get me wrong, the card game or whatever between him and KGB was great. I enjoyed that. I was kind of sitting there like, man, I want more of this shit. I want more of this in this movie. I don't, this would have been a great movie, and I'm sure, there's tons of poker movies that probably fill that, will get that scratch or whatever. But just the fact they dropped off, like, if nothing else, instead of having Matt Damon's character dropping off the money at the courthouse or whatever, maybe it would have been a nice little cathartic scene to have Worm show up again and be like, nah, dude, I'm done with you. Like, just to have the relationship kind of cap off, right?
Yeah.
Because I wonder if him saying maybe to her, like, oh, maybe I will be needing a lawyer, does that in any way mean Worm is not going away and at some point I'm going to get in trouble with Worm? Or is that just like a funny thing to say to her?
I figure that means that the character of Mike just knows he's going to be getting into shenanigans as he goes off to Vegas.
But Worm was his shenanigan guy, so
his plan is to find a new shenanigan guy. That sounds great. All right, so let's go around the table. Bobby, recommendation. What are you telling people about this movie? Should they watch it today?
I mean, I thought it was an interesting movie. I think there's some redeeming-ish qualities to it. So, I mean, I would say let's have a couple drinks. Let's watch Rounders.
Do you put Rounders on while you're playing poker? No, maybe not.
Yeah,
right.
I think no. I think that would. I mean, it definitely made me kind of. I wouldn't say I wanted to play poker, but it made me want to like have some fun with the guys, basically.
Matt, what are you telling people?
Pass. I would tell them.
There it is.
I would tell them pass. It's just not that engaging of a movie, to be honest. If somebody who hasn't seen this movie hasn't seen it already, pass. Just go watch poker on TV.
You'd actually learn more by watching poker on TV. I'm going to go with, if you do not actually play the game, specifically Texas Hold'em, we didn't even say what they were playing the whole time. Texas Hold'em. If you don't know the game, I'll agree with Matt. Turn on ESPN when it's World Series of Poker. I don't even know when that happens anymore because it's not in the overall theme of what they show on TV anymore. So it's definitely specific. If you know poker, I think you'll enjoy it. Leading up to that last scene, the tension there was fantastic. But outside of that, I don't see the pull, and I don't see the pull if you don't actually know the game. So, as always, thank you for listening to the Re-Review Podcast. And remember, if you can't spot the sucker in your first half an hour at the table, then you are the sucker.